Thank you all for being here. My talk today is titled A Dialectical Future for Behavioral and Evolutionary Ecology. And though I think that much of what I'm saying today will apply to evolutionary ecology as well, my focus is really going to be on the study of animal behavior in natural contexts. And I think this talk today is probably pretty different than a lot of talks that you've seen in your departments or even at the Miller. But it's motivated by two things that I suspect we all agree on. First is that we all agree that interdisciplinary work is valuable. The whole reason we come together here at the Miller at these lunches is to find connections across disciplines. And my goal today is to stretch how you think of interdisciplinarity a little bit. And the second is this idea I believe all of us in this room will find intriguing, which is how can we think in new and different ways in science? In this talk, I'm going to consider that one way in which we can shift into new modes of thinking in science is by asking fundamentally different questions, which of course then prompts the follow-up question, how do we ask different questions? And that is the subject of my talk today. Specifically, I'm starting from something called standpoint theory, which is rooted in feminist and Marxist ways of thought and makes explicit the role of politics in how we construct knowledge. What I mean here by politics is the total complex of relations between people living in society, which includes, but is not limited to, what I'm guessing you think of when you hear the word politics. So, what is a standpoint? A standpoint is a way of looking at the world that emerges from involvement in collective political struggle against a dominant perspective. Engaging in political struggle against a dominant narrative allows one to really see aspects of human social relations and the natural world that are not easily accessible from dominant perspectives. Standpoints reveal new ways of looking at existing questions and thus generate different questions. Part of the reason that I study animal behavior is because it's a particularly interesting place in which to look at the impact of scientific narratives that align with and push back against dominant political narratives. We ask questions about animals, and the answers directly shape what we think of as natural. And then we use that sense of what is natural to shape how we think about ourselves, our relationships, and how our societies work. But if the questions we are asking are themselves shaped by dominant cultural and political narratives and closed off to other possible ways of describing nature, then what we've ended up doing through our science is simply legitimizing these dominant narratives. In my talk today, I'm going to first tell you about the dominant narrative in my field of behavioral ecology, which is that of adaptationism. I'm then going to give you an example of what it looks like to push back against that dominant narrative from a collaboration I was part of that was published in 2019. And finally, I'm going to explore where this dominant narrative may have come from politically and what an alternative to it might be. So, in the field of behavioral ecology, the framework within which we often ask our questions is the framework of adaptation by natural selection. And so, just so we're all on the same page, here's a definition that I've pulled from the National Geographic website, which is that adaptation is any heritable trait that helps an organism survive and reproduce in its environment. And just a bit of jargon that's helpful to know, which is that we behavioral ecologists refer to this aggregate of survival and reproduction as fitness. And when we talk of costs and benefits of traits in this context, we mean, does a trait impact fitness negatively, which would make it a cost, or positively, which would make it a benefit? Adaptation, of course, is a hugely important force that shapes our natural world and is the subject of a tremendous amount of research in our field. And I want to emphatically say that I am not pushing back against the idea of adaptation in this talk. What I'm pushing back against is the notion of adaptationism, by which I mean a way of studying nature that centers the role of adaptation in shaping natural variation among living organisms, a way of looking at the world through a lens where adaptation matters more than any other process. So when we do work in behavioral ecology from an adaptationist perspective, we start by finding an interesting trait out there in nature, say this throat fan on a lizard. And then we ask, in what way might this trait be an adaptation? In what way might it be maximizing individual fitness? What are its costs and benefits in the currency of fitness? And then you collect data and ask, okay, did the data match our expectations of what we think should be happening if this trait were an adaptation? And if we find that they match, we are satisfied that we have understood how the trait evolved because we have found an adaptive explanation for it. And if we find a gap here between what we expect to be happening and what is, That's a puzzle. That's a paradox. We ask, well, how did this trait evolve if it's not adaptive? And then in response to this paradox, we either say, well, maybe we're misunderstanding the costs and benefits here. So let's elucidate them a bit better and revise our understanding of what should be happening. Or else there must be other forces of nature, things like random genetic drift or stochasticity, phylogenetic constraint or physiological constraint, or just heterogeneity and variation that we haven't quantified well and it's really complicated. And all of these things, these forces, are preventing the expression out there in nature of this fitness maximizing adaptive optimum that we think should be happening. And so the point here is not that we never consider things other than adaptation in the adaptationist program. We do. The point is, where and how do these things show up in our narratives in relation to adaptation? When we view nature through an adaptationist lens, our image of nature is defined by a notion of what should be happening that is derived largely from the logic of fitness maximization, coupled with enough natural context to make a prediction that seems sensible in the system that we're studying. And when we juxtapose this image of what we think should be happening onto what is actually happening, it looks like our image of what is obscured by all of these other things. When our image of what is doesn't match what we expect to see, it's almost like then we try to polish the lens further and we move it closer and further away to better get the two images of what should be and what is to match one another. But we seem to forget that we're looking through a lens and that lenses can not only magnify and clarify what we see, but also distort them. And the way in which this distortion produced by the adaptationist lens becomes really clear is by focusing on this gap between what should be and what is. This is because we are motivated by the gap between what should be and what is in the way that I described earlier. We see these gaps between our rational expectations of how an animal should behave according to the theory of natural selection and a seemingly irrational reality of how this animal is actually behaving. And then we try to find rational explanations for that gap. But whether or not something appears rational or irrational depends extremely strongly upon our assumptions. And the impact of our assumptions on the nature of inquiry in evolutionary biology is something that is quite clear, I think, in a question that we tackled in a collaborative paper co-authored by Julia Monk, Erin Giglio, me, Max Lambert, and Caitlin McDonough that was published in 2019. And what we take on in this paper is the way that we currently study same-sex sexual behavior, which we call SSB, and its evolutionary relationship with different sex sexual behavior, which we call DSB. Specifically, we ask, what are the assumptions that lead SSB to be considered a paradox? I'm going to start by describing how SSB is currently considered a paradox in when it's considered sort of by evolutionary biologists. In sexually reproducing animals, by and large, mating with individuals of the same sex is not going to produce offspring, and thus does not immediately contribute to fitness. And so it seems paradoxical for animals to expend time and energy in mating with individuals of the same sex, because that's time and energy that they are not spending producing offspring by engaging in DSB, different sex sexual behavior. Framed this way, it seems obvious that the costs of SSB are really high. And so we expect natural selection would act against SSB if it were to arise in a population, because natural selection maximizes fitness. However, SSB persists, so there must be either an explanation for why it persists that relies on some other benefits that we haven't yet considered, or on some constraints that prevent fitness maximization from being realized. And but for those constraints, SSB would be eliminated. So what we do in our paper is to upturn this narrative that I just presented to you by asking a couple of simple questions about the assumptions underlying it. First is the assumption that engaging in SSB is costly to fitness, that individuals that engage in same-sex sexual behavior have lower fitness than individuals that don't engage in same-sex sexual behavior. But what if the cost is not actually that high? What if in general, same-sex sexual behavior is one of many, many, many reasons that a mating may not lead to the production of offspring? Second is the assumption that SSB has evolved from an ancestral state of DSB, that SSB arises and evolves from a population in which all of the individuals are engaging in DSB in this quote unquote perfect manner, right? But what if that's not true? And the ancestral state is instead mating behavior that is indiscriminate with regard to sex. It's worth noting that both of the assumptions that we question here are aligned with the social and political status quo of heteronormativity at best and homophobia at worst, on the heteronormative notions of queer sex as aberrational and somehow excessive. So, in our paper, we conjecture that in fact, across animals, SSB is not all that costly in terms of time, energy, and fitness. And this would imply that when we look carefully and unbiasedly at the degree of SSB shown by individuals and populations, we will see tons of variation across both individuals and populations in the degree of SSB in a manner that is influenced by context dependent costs and benefits, historical contingencies, and more. And further, we expect this variation to manifest across the animal phylogeny, tracing back to an ancestor that mates indiscriminately. So in this paper, we posed alternative hypotheses and new questions to consider empirically. And it's been really exciting to see that within just a year, our paper motivated further research that builds on our ideas, formalizes them mathematically, and shows that they're actually quite plausible. Okay, so now we're going to move to asking about the political underpinnings of this narrative of adaptationism. And the link here becomes really clear when we ask the question, where does the normativity of adaptationism come from? Why are we focused on these notions of what should be happening? And the clearest explanation that I've seen comes from the philosopher Samir Okasha's work on agents and goals in evolution, where he clearly traces this normativity to the notion of the rational agent. Okasha draws the parallels between adaptationism and rationality when he says, in both cases, we begin with a conception of how things should be in order that a particular end be achieved, and try to show that how they actually are is a close match. And this was a really exciting thing for me to read for two reasons. One is I had been using this distinction of what should be versus what is way before I read this paragraph. So to see exactly that same language was really powerful. And second, and we'll get to this maybe in a second, this author does not share my politics. And so it wasn't as though we were coming from the same lens. This is coming from an author who's not, who's sort of approaching this in a more, from a different perspective and coming to the same conclusion that adaptation and the notion of rationality are intrinsically linked. And the part that I want to highlight here especially is this in order that a particular end be achieved. The end is not, is this the best explanation for the data? The end is, how can we think of these data as being consistent with the framework centered on fitness maximization? Those are not the same thing. Moreover, this rational agent underlies both how we think about adaptation and how we think about human interactions in a capitalist economy. And this is reflected not just in the way we talk about maximization of fitness or of utility, but also in the mathematical tools of game theory that we employ in both domains as a further formalization of the actions of a rational agent. So what are some ways of looking at the world that don't privilege adaptation above all else? If we come back to the notion of standpoint theory, we can ask, who is engaged in political struggle against capitalism, and how do they see the natural world? And so one compelling option here, of course, is the dialectical materialist lens, where instead of a construction based on what should be and what is, we ask what is, what could have led to it, and what happens now that we are here. And in doing so, we lose that outside focus on normativity, and adaptation becomes one of many processes that are interconnected and contingent on one another. And while it's difficult to say exactly what distortions the dialectical materialist lens is going to produce, I can say that the focus here is not so much on any one process, but on the mechanistic and historically contingent connections between them. And so I want to end by telling you about an organism that, more than any other animal I have encountered, insists upon this different way of thinking, and that is the tent caterpillar. At the start of my time at the Miller, I was in search of a new study system for reasons, a new study system where I could study social interactions in the context of group living animals that build nests together. And tent caterpillars seemed like a really great group in which to do this work because we know a ton about their basic biology and natural history. But the thing is, we've known about their basic biology and natural history for quite a long time, and yet they don't seem to show up as an organism that is used to understand broader conceptual things about the evolution of collective behavior or social behavior. And James Costa, who's a really great scholar of these quote unquote other insect societies, which is to say not bees or wasps or ants or termites, he's made this same lament that it is weird that we don't better understand tent caterpillar sociality in the broader conceptual context of behavioral ecology. And so my initial thought was, okay, I'm going to read about tent caterpillars and spend some time in the field watching them and understanding them. And surely I will come up with the right adaptive questions to start asking. But my contention now is that the adaptationist lens is the wrong lens for tent caterpillars. It distorts or renders opaque more than it clarifies. Basically, I think that tent caterpillars are conceptually inaccessible, not uniquely, but more so than many other organisms than we study from an adaptationist perspective. And this became apparent to me when I read The Dialectical Biologist by Richard Levins and Richard Lewontin. And this book not only helped me understand why tent caterpillars are a thorn in the side of adaptationism, but also offers a way forward. And so the starting point here is different. It's this contention that in any system, what constitutes the parts is defined by the whole being considered, that you can't simply break things down. And so this means specifically that when you are dealing with organisms that interact with one another and with their environment, which is every organism, you have to think about two things. First, you have to think about how various levels of organization, so from gene to individual, to populations, to communities and species, are only partly autonomous and are reciprocally interacting. And so in the context of selection, you need a multi-level selection approach that includes group selection. And this is extremely clear in the case of tent caterpillars, where first of all, there are a ton of them, and they forage together and shelter together, and they clearly impact one another's lives. But second, these groups are in fact very fluid and not necessarily made up of relatives later in the season, especially, and they become more solitary as they age, suggesting that you can't simply treat groups as fixed units as you can with bees and ants and termites often, but also you can't ignore the groups. They are partly autonomous and reciprocally interacting. And second, a dialectical materialist approach that contends that parts and wholes cannot be separated implies that you have to think about organisms and environments actively co-determining each other in a way that is suggested by the niche construction discourse. And here again, tent caterpillars are a great example. Not only do they literally construct this tent-like structure shown here in the yellow circle, in which they shelter and on which they interact and communicate with one another, but also their main activity in this time of their lives is eating leaves. And by eating the leaves that surround them, they are directly changing the environmental conditions of their surroundings. These conditions in turn determine their growth, their hunger, and their further capacity to shape their environments. The organism and the environment are actively co-determining one another. And so tent caterpillars are, to me, making the case for a very different way of looking at nature than currently offered by the adaptationist lens that shapes my field of behavioral ecology. And I think we will learn something new about them from a dialectical materialist approach that is grounded in multi-level selection and niche construction. But I don't think it's just tent caterpillars. I think we'll learn more about every organism from this dialectical materialist perspective, because every organism interacts with other organisms and with its environment. And this, I think, is where the dialectical future of behavioral and evolutionary ecology lies. So is it possible to do things differently than we currently do? And more importantly, is it possible to think differently? And more importantly, is it possible to actually do things differently? And the answer has to be yes, because we need to imagine different questions with more nuance, consistently interrogating assumptions if we want to do a better job of understanding and engaging with nature. And to do this effectively, we have to embrace our politics explicitly, not only because we can never escape our politics, but because our politics are epistemologically informative. And so I want to end by emphasizing that almost none of the overarching critique of the links between adaptationism and capitalism that I've described to you here are new. They've been well constructed within biology for decades in the work of evolutionary biologists such as Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin, Richard Levins, David Sloan Wilson, Kevin Leyland, Eva Jablonka, Marion Lamb, Robin Wall Kimmerer, and many others. These critiques are also well developed in fields of scholarship outside of biology, in fields such as science and technology studies, philosophy, and the history of science. What we need now isn't just more critique. What we need is actionable changes from scientists in the ways in which we construct our questions that allow for asking different kinds of questions. I've been trying to do this a bit in my own work, such as our recent paper on character displacement in an ecosystem of these two interacting species of lizards found in small islands off the east coast of Florida that we first sampled in 2010 and then went back to in 2019 after one island went from being a one species island to a two species island. And our initial goal was to show that this very adaptive process of character displacement is important despite variation across space and time. And we presented our findings in that way. But then I read the Dialectical Biologist at the time when we had reviews, between our initial submission and the revised submission, and I realized the extent of the underlying adaptationism in our paper. And in the revisions, we were able to reapproach these data with much less of a focus on the adaptive process and much more from the perspective that the messy realities of both inexplicable variation across space and time and doing opportunistically long-term fieldwork were not in opposition to the story of character displacement, but in fact make it way more interesting. And so here's a really tangible example of a change that we made between initial and final submission. The details really don't matter here, but in our initial submission, we had these data from 2019 that were included in the main body of the paper. And again, the details don't matter, but you can see how nice and parallel all of these lines are across the 4 different islands. And the much messier 2010 data were initially in the supplementary material. We weren't ignoring them, we weren't pretending that they didn't exist, but they didn't fit the adaptive narrative that we had presented in the main paper. But in the final paper, we included both of these data sets from 2010 and 2019, along with hypothesized non-adaptive reasons for the differences we saw. And these reasons included changes to sort of our data collection process that happened between the 2 years into the main results of the paper. And they were part of the story of science that we were telling. Stepping back, a broader effort ongoing that I'm especially excited about is a recent call for papers to be published in a scientific journal and read by scientists, for which we've assembled a team of editors who work in disciplines across the natural and social sciences and humanities. And our goal is specifically to bring not just interdisciplinary critique of the scientific process in front of the eyes of scientists, but also for authors to make concrete suggestions for how scientific practice can change when we consider diverse standpoints. And so while I know that all of you here hugely believe in the value of interdisciplinarity within the natural and physical sciences, I'd urge you to consider extending this umbrella to the social sciences and humanities as well, because you may be surprised by the impact that this will have on your own scientific research. So that, I just want to thank all of the folks whose thoughts and research has influenced this talk, including my coaches, Ali, Ekta, and Chang, as well as thanks to everyone in the Miller community for your support over the last few years, and thank you all for listening.